Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 40, where we see the psalmist's confidence in the Lord. Back in Psalm 38, we saw a confession of sin and a plea for an end to discipline. The psalmist had done some wrong things, and he's saying, "Lord, enough already." And not only that, there are those that are carrying this discipline a bit too far. He's not complaining to God about God, but about some others that have sort of taken up the cause. And then Psalm 39, there's a determination not to sin any longer and a request to be restored. And now we come to Psalm 40, where we see confidence in the Lord's coming deliverance. Has it arrived yet? Well, it perhaps has in part, but we're not finished yet. And yet the psalmist is confident, even as he asks, Lord, can we be there right now? So we're going to start in praise of God. Now, let me talk a bit about the superscription. I usually don't mention those, and this one isn't anything that we haven't already seen before a number of times. For the choir director, a psalm of David. I take these superscriptions to be authoritative. Now, not everybody does, and that's okay. But I take them to be authoritative because when we find the very oldest Hebrew manuscripts that we found, I'm not talking just about the Masoretic texts, like the Codex Leningrad that goes back to 1005 AD, but when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls that were copied before Jesus came along, back in the before Christ times, these superscriptions were there as well. Now, I can't say for sure they were in the original text, but they're very old, and I personally take them as being authoritative, even though there are times, this isn't one of them, but there are times where we look at the Septuagint, that's what LXX stands for, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, and once in a while, the Septuagint will either leave off a superscription or maybe even once in a very rare time will give a substitute superscription. In spite of that, I take the Hebrew superscription as being authoritative. And in this case, we've seen for the choir director a lot of times in the Psalms so far, and what we call, and I haven't referred to this, but this is the first book of Psalms. And when we get to chapter 41, that's going to be the last of the first book, and then starts a new collection. We'll see that next time. But this is evidently used in public worship. Now, I think all of the Psalms can be used in public worship, but some of them are specifically designed for that, and this is one of those, one of many. So let's begin in the psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord, and the term here, I waited patiently, kavo kivati, and that doesn't sound like it if you're not used to hearing Hebrew, but that's actually the same word, two different forms of the same word. Um, and when you want to say something in Hebrew and intensify it, what you do is you say it twice. So if I wanted to be overly literal, and I'm not saying we should be, but you could say, I waited with waiting, or something like that. Now that doesn't sound like good English. So they gave us good English here. I waited patiently, saying the same thing. And what you do is when you have that kind of repetition, you're saying, I really waited. This is intensified. For example, back in Genesis chapter 2, God says, in the day that you eat of that forbidden fruit, now our translation says you will certainly die. Actually, the word death is there twice, not for two deaths, but for to intensify. It's really going to happen. You really are going to die. Well, here he really waited. He waited and waited, and it's the idea of he waited patiently. Notice I waited there for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. So he is waiting, and there was maybe some considerable waiting, but eventually God shows up, and he's praising God for having inclined. Now think about the graphic picture. That's quite accurate. To bend down, to look down, as though from heaven he focused his gaze down toward us and heard my cry. Verse 2, he brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. Now think about the opposing ideas. On the one hand, he brings him up out of a place that's sort of slippery and slidey and muddy, and then put his feet upon something that's the polar opposite of that. Uh, Gave him a firm footrest, a firm place to stand. Verse 3, he put a new song in my mouth. And I think of all the different times, I think there's six different times where where the psalmist is commanded, where he gives a command, sing to the Lord a new song. But here we find out it doesn't have to be a command, that God placed it there. He was so excited about what God has done that he burst forth with a new song, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and trust in the Lord. And the idea here is because God is worthy of our praise, that people see. And notice, we don't often talk about fear, but we should, because the fear of the Lord is recognizing that God is God and we're not. That's part of our praise. Really, to be afraid of Him, not a fear that drives us away, but a fear that brings us wonder and awe and into His presence as we trust in Him. Verse 4, how blessed is the man who has made the Lord his trust. Now, think about what that's saying, because when we make the Lord our trust, we're saying He's worthy of our faith. You see, faith by itself isn't all that valuable unless it is placed upon something that is secure. If you have your faith on something or someone that's not faithful, then that's actually a bad thing. But if you've made the Lord your trust, then remember, He's that secure foundation. And notice the rest of it, and has not turned to the proud, nor to those who lapse into falsehood. So you want to make sure your faith goes in the right direction, to the right individual, to the Lord. He is worthy of our faith and trust. So verses 1 through 4 tell the reader about God, praising Him. And now, as we come to verse 5, we're going to address God in that praise. So we've been talking about God in verses 1 through 4. Now we're going to talk to God beginning in verse 5. Many, O Lord, my God, are the wonders which you have shown. And so he's addressing God. He's praising God for what He has done, the wonders He has shown, and your thoughts toward us. There's none to compare with you. If I would declare and speak of them, they would be too numerous to count. God is infinite, and He is the only one. Now I know there are certain religions that want to picture that the idea of many gods, and that God is only one among a bunch of others. The Mormons, for example, are wrong in that area. God is God alone. There's none to compare with God. And if we look at all of the ways that God is larger than us, that He's bigger than us, that He's magnificent, His wonders, there are way too many to count. Verse 6, sacrifice and meal offering you have not desired. My ears you have opened. We're going to come back and look at that. And then burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. So two things that God has not called for. Now, that doesn't mean that God didn't establish sacrifice and meal offering and burnt offering and sin offering. Those were things that God had established, but there's something more than just that, something more than just the mere ceremony that God wants. And notice that phrase, my ears you have opened. Now, the New English translation renders that a bit more conversational, trying to get the meaning behind it. Notice how it says, receiving sacrifices and offerings are not your primary concern. That's not literal, but I think that's the idea behind it. And then instead of my ears you have opened, it says, you make that quite clear to me. That's supposedly the meaning behind that phrase. And then he finishes the last line, you do not ask for burnt sacrifices and offerings. That's a New English translation. I think they're trying to get the correct idea across. The Tanakh version, this is a Hebrew meant for Jewish people. It's still in English. You gave me to understand that you do not desire sacrifice and meal offerings. You do not ask for burnt offerings and sin offerings. Notice that you gave me to understand. That's my ears you've opened. So again, that idea, you made it plain. You've spoken that. However, when you look at the Septuagint version, specifically of the very old manuscript, the Sinaiticus, and others around this same era, it's not that this manuscript is the only one that does this, but the older manuscripts, instead of saying, my ears you have opened, which is an interesting figure of speech, says something entirely different, a body you have prepared. Now, that begs the question, did they change the text, or was this a typo that went in one direction or the other originally? I find it interesting that the book of Hebrews actually cites the Septuagint version, this early Septuagint version, because later on in the Septuagint you find that were other copies much later render it my ears you've opened in the Greek text. When we're talking about the Septuagint, we're talking about the Greek text. But Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5 follows the Septuagint reading of the Sinaiticus. Sinaiticus is a very old manuscript, discovered actually in the 1800s at a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. Well, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5 says, therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And in the context of Hebrews, that's speaking about how this is a messianic prophecy. Now, my ears you have opened probably wouldn't get that idea across, but a body you have prepared does get that idea across, where the writer of Hebrews sees this as describing as Jesus doing the speaking. That you have prepared a body, look, sacrifices and meal offerings, that wasn't enough, burnt offerings and sin offerings, that wasn't enough. What you really needed was a body to be prepared. That is the incarnation, so that with that body he could bear the sins of many. Verse 7, perhaps catching the same messianic idea, then I said, behold, I come. Think about who came, okay? Now, here is the writer of the psalm, but maybe as the writer of the psalm is saying this, he's saying more than he realizes, because what do you mean he comes? Behold, I come. In the scroll of the book, it is written of me, of the person writing it, or of someone beyond that. Verse 8, I delight to do your will, oh my God. Your law is within my heart. And picking up on this idea, Hebrews goes on, chapter 10, verse 9. Then he said, behold, I've come to do your will. And notice he's just quoting the passage the way we have it. And that's not just in the Sinaiticus. That section is in all of the Septuagint and Hebrew manuscripts. But he continues, he takes away the first, that is the first regarding the sacrifices and the offerings and all of those celebratory things that were found in the law, all of the rituals. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will, I delight to do your will. By this will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. So the writer to the book of Hebrews sees this, not just the previous verse, but this one as well, as a messianic prophecy of the one who came to do God's will, not just the rituals, but the reality behind the ritual and fulfilling all to which the ritual pointed. And Jesus accomplished that. Verse 9, I have proclaimed glad tidings of righteousness in the great congregation. Behold, I will not restrain my lips, O Lord, you know. Verse 10, I have not hidden your righteousness within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed. Notice how it goes from positive to negative to positive, and another positive thrown in. I've not concealed your loving kindness and your truth from the great congregation. And notice how he speaks at the beginning of the great congregation. I proclaimed these glad tidings of righteousness in the great congregation, and have not concealed your loving kindness at the end, and your truth from the great congregation. So that the reference to great congregation sort of serves as bookends for the work and words of the one who is coming. Not just his work, but also his words. Now, we've seen in verses 1 through 4 where the writer was telling the reader about God, and then verses 5 through 10 where he addresses God in praise, and now he's still going to continue to address God, but it will now be in petition, not just praising the Lord, but also asking the Lord to accomplish something. So we come now to the petition section. But he's going to actually begin with words of assurance. I'm going to ask, but I already know you're going to answer. You, O Lord, will not withhold your compassion from me. Your loving kindness and your truth will continually preserve me. He states that before he asks. He's going to, present the problem. Um, it's much easier to ask for something when you know it's going to be given. And so he states with assurance that idea. Verse 12 then gives the problem. It's twofold. Verse 12, for evils beyond number have surrounded me. Those are outside things. You're surrounded by something on the outside. My iniquities have overtaken me. This is maybe on the inside. He's the one who did these things. And so we had that theme from as early as a couple of chapters ago, from a couple of Psalms ago, back in Psalm 38. They've overtaken me so that I'm not able to see. They are more numerous than the hairs of my head, and my heart has failed me. The bad stuff is really bad, both without and let me just say within. It's one thing when you have problems outside, you can run away from those. You can get away from those. The problems on the inside, that's tough because you're the one responsible, and he sees that. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. Make haste, O Lord, to help me. So here's the petition he's asking. Now, when we see this, I have to note that verses 13, both this section and all the way down to verse 17, are going to be recycled almost word for word when we get to Psalm 70. It will be a standalone psalm where this is going to be taken. So let's pause here and let's look at Psalm 70. What I did is I put them side by side, where you can see Psalm 40, be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. Psalm 70, O God, and notice the difference between O Lord, Yahweh, that's the name for God, and then O God, deliver me. O Lord, hasten to my help. So a little bit of difference here. So make haste, hasten to help me, to my help. Verse 14 in chapter 40, let those be ashamed and humiliated together who seek my life to destroy it. Again, essentially the same thing said in Psalm 70. In latter part of verse 14, let those be turned back and dishonored who delight my hurt. Again, almost the same thing, almost identical. Let those be turned back and dishonored who delight my hurt. Verse 15, let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. Let those be turned back. That's sort of like the same idea of being appalled because of their shame, who say, aha, aha. In verse 16, let all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. Let those who love your salvation say continually, the Lord be magnified. The same thing, except instead of Lord, it says, let God be magnified, but it's essentially the same verse. And finally, verse 17, since I'm afflicted and needy, here notice, but I am afflicted and needy. And then you have the let the Lord be mindful of me. But then it ends with the last two lines, you are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. Same thing here, you are my help and my deliverer. O Lord, do not delay. So the biggest difference is sometimes, not in every case, but in some cases, whether God is called God or Yahweh the Lord. That's the primary area of difference between these two sections. So let's pick up where we left off, verse 14. We said, be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. That's the request. Make haste, O Lord, to help me. Again, he says it's really the same request, just said in different words. Verse 14, let those be ashamed and humiliated together who seek my life to destroy it. So notice they're seeking my life. They're trying to bring me down. And that seeking term is going to come back. Let those be turned back and dishonored. So that's sort of saying the same thing. Let them be ashamed and humiliated. Let them be turned back and dishonored who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame. We already talked about being ashamed and humiliated. Now let them be appalled because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. And apparently with the tone of voice, I'm sure I'm not doing it right. But that's a put down. That's like, gotcha, sort of idea. And Lord, you deliver, and those who are coming against me, you take care of them, who are seeking, who are delighting, and who are saying in a wrong way. However, verse 16, let all who seek in a right way, let all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. Let all those who love your salvation continually say, the Lord be magnified. And so here, notice he's speaking to God. We had that petition, and he's still doing that. This is still part of the petition. But verse 17, and I think this is part of the petition too, but notice how it's addressing God, not in the second person, but in the third person. Since I am afflicted and needy, let the Lord be mindful of me. So sort of speaking about God, but it's still part of the petition. And then verse 17, you are my help. And he's back to speaking, second person, singular, speaking to God. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. So you're my help. You're my deliverer. And make it happen now. Do not delay, oh my God. Now, as I look at those closing words, I can't help but think of how our salvation was brought about by one who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you put me to shame? Why have you made me afflicted and needy?" And this is a reminder that he is our help, that God is our help and our deliverer, because Jesus was without help, was without deliverance upon the cross. When he cried out, my God, he was not answered. He was afflicted and needy, so that we will not be afflicted and needy, so that God will be our help and our deliverance from our affliction, from our need. And we find our need met as we come to him in faith.